All right, let's dive right in. Today, we are getting into what I like to call the engine room of ISO 55001 asset management. We're talking about Clause 8, operation. This is where all that careful strategic planning finally meets the real world and gets put to the ultimate test. Okay, so think about this. You've put in all that hard work on Clause 6, right? You've set your objectives, you've crafted these beautiful asset management plans. That's fantastic. But let's be real for a second. A plan that's just sitting on a shelf, it's just paper. The real challenge, the big question, is how do you actually make it happen, day in and day out? How do you bring that plan to life? And that is exactly where Clause 8 comes into play. It really is the critical bridge connecting your high-level strategy to the actual work happening on the ground. This whole clause, it's all about the doing. It's about planning, implementing, and, maybe most importantly, controlling the very processes that make your entire system tick.
So let's start digging into the specifics. First up, Section 8.1, putting plans into action. You can really think of this as the core instruction manual for your whole operational system.
So, Section 8.1 basically gives us 5 key pillars for operational control. It starts with Step 1. You've got to establish the criteria for your processes. Think of these as the rules of the game. Then, Step 2 is implementing controls to make sure everybody actually plays by those rules. And what's really important here is Step 3 and 4. You're not just monitoring and treating risks, you also have to be actively monitoring and implementing opportunities. And finally, Step 5 is all about managing those variables. Juggling the risks, the opportunities, the costs, and performance to make sure you are squeezing every single drop of value out of your assets.
Now here's what makes this so incredibly powerful. The standard is really clear on this. You have to apply this control across the entire asset lifecycle. We're not just talking about the day-to-day operations, no. We're talking about managing an asset from the very moment it's just an idea, all the way to its final disposal. It's the whole shebang, from cradle to grave.
So, what do we actually mean by life cycle processes? Well, the standard defines it pretty clearly. It's the full sequence of stages an asset goes through, from the moment it's created or acquired, all the way to its end of life. And honestly, getting your head around this concept is absolutely fundamental if you want to do asset management right.
And that journey covers, well, everything. We're talking about the initial creation or acquisition, right? Then its daily utilization and, of course, all of the maintenance that goes with it. Then you've got any improvements, modifications, or renewals, all the way to its final disposal. The key takeaway? Every single one of these stages needs its own specific plan and its own set of controls.
What I find so smart about this is how the standard forces you to take a balanced approach. It's not enough to just play defense, right? You can't just focus on mitigating risks to stop value from leaking out. You also have to play offense, proactively hunting for those opportunities to create more value. Clause 8 really demands that you manage both sides of that scale perfectly.
But that brings up the million-dollar question, doesn't it? How do you actually prove any of this is happening? Well, the standard is crystal clear on this point. You need documented information. And look, I know what you might be thinking. More paperwork. But trust me, this is not about creating bureaucracy for its own sake. It's about building a concrete, auditable trail. It's your proof that your processes are under control and are running exactly the way you plan.
Of course, in the real world, operations are never static. You know the old saying, change is the only constant. So the big question is, how do you manage all that change without completely derailing your asset plan? Well, that brings us to the next critical piece of this puzzle, Section 8.2, which is all about controlling change.
And the key here is really a two-part responsibility. First, you have to control the changes you plan to make. That's obvious. But just as important, you also have to review the unintended consequences of those changes, the ripple effects. And then you have to take action to mitigate any negative impacts. So it's about being proactive with your plans, but also being reactive to what actually happens on the ground.
Okay, but what about the parts of your operation that you don't handle directly? We're talking about outsourcing, which is a huge part of modern business. That's exactly where Clause 8.3 comes in. The main point here is that just because you've handed a process over to an external partner, your responsibility for it doesn't just, disappear.
To manage this properly, the standard says you have to clearly define 3 key things. First is the scope and interfaces. Basically, where does their work stop and yours begin? How do the two connect? Second, responsibilities and authorities. You have to know who on your team is ultimately accountable for that external provider. And third, knowledge and information sharing.
What's the process for sharing critical data back and forth? I mean, without clear answers to these questions, you simply can't have real control.
And it really doesn't stop there. You have to make sure these externally provided processes are fully integrated into your whole system. What does that mean? Well, it means they're held to the same requirements of clauses 7 and 8. It means they're monitored just like your internal processes are, in line with clause 9.1. And maybe most importantly, you have to ensure they are aligned with your overall strategic asset management plan. Your partners can't just be some separate island. They have to be part of the main continent.
So let's pull this all together. When you combine these three core elements, that's solid operational planning, disciplined change control, and seamless management of your external partners, what you end up with isn't just a list of rules to follow. You get a single, cohesive, and frankly, an incredibly powerful operational system.
And that right there is the ultimate takeaway from Clause 8. It's this powerful combination, operational planning across the whole life cycle, plus really tight change control, plus excellent external control. That is the formula for achieving the true goal of asset management, which is total value realization.
Which really just leaves us with one final crucial question for you to think about. When you look at your own organization, are your daily operations just a frantic scramble to keep the lights on? Or are they a controlled, integrated system that is consciously and deliberately delivering on the value you promised in your strategic plans? Clause 8 gives you the framework to make absolutely sure it's the latter.